My name's Adrian Walker. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next two speakers who are both going to be addressing the topic of faith as the fulfillment of reason. Our first speaker is Professor Emmanuel Tourpe, who received his doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of Louvain in Belgium, and his habilitation, as the Germans say, at Strasbourg, and is currently teaching philosophy at the Faculty of Studies at of the Society of Jesus in Brussels, the LIOT as it's called. He's written very extensively on topics concerning the relationship between theology and philosophy and also metaphysics. He's written on Gustav Siewert, the great German Thomist philosopher, and also on Franz von Baader, and again several titles in metaphysics. So before I give him the word, I just want to remind both of our speakers that we really need to keep the presentations to 30 minutes or less so that we can have ample time for discussion, because that's important. So without further ado, I give you Professor Tourpe. Thank you very much.
So at first, I would like to ask your mercy for at least three reasons. The first is that my laborious reading will certainly be a little bit dry, as philosophical matters are. The second reason is that perhaps I think that you have my text under the eyes. Yes, I will read only some passages of the text in order to shorten my intervention and to be within the limits I was given. And the third reason is that I beg your pardon for my awful French accent. At least consider it as a folkloric piece of fun. Yes. And the speech I'm about to give you is entitled Cogitor ergo cogito, amabor ergo amo. That means I'm thought, therefore I think. I'm loved, therefore I love. From an intellectual point of view, Judeo-Christian revelation had a very dramatic consequence. At the same time, it resolved and increased the tension between the differences that the human mind had previously kept apart. Indeed, for the pagan world, as well as for other religious traditions, the complex array of concepts in philosophy and theology presented a spectrum of possible contradictions or confusions. For example, unity and multiplicity, nature and history, reality and ideality, the finite and the infinite, mythos and logos, immanence and transcendence, man and woman, individual and community, and so forth. Intellectually speaking, Christian revelation assumes that the most significant conceptual differences are neither contradictory nor equivalent. Instead, they must be thought together in, that's the word, polarities. These polarities are all rooted in Christ, as Romano Guardini, Eric Pshiwara, Gaston Fessard, and Hans Urs von Balthasar also, in Christ. The differences are clearly opened up, decisively assumed and surpassed, all at the same time. In the history of Western culture, there are three traditional pairs of opposites rooted in pagan thought that were affected by revelation in a particular way. First, we may consider the so-called opposition between the divine logos and the flesh, which the incarnation brings to reconciliation. Second, there is the relationship between love and truth, i.e., between practical and theoretical reason, which was reformulated as a polarity in spite of their previous opposition. But finally, there is the classical contradiction between faith and reason, which is now to be interpreted again as a polarity rather than as an outright contradiction or confusion. What is peculiar to Christianity is that it intensifies the difference between the two poles on the one hand, while on the other, it requires their reciprocal dependence. This is why Christianity reaches a climax in the dogma of Chalcedon, in which the polarity of God and man is realized and becomes manifest in Christ. This is not to say that the aforementioned polarities, namely flesh divinity, love knowledge, and faith reason, were immediately taken into consideration in Christianity itself. It takes a long time to become conscious of all of the intellectual implications the incarnation has for our thinking. It's not a surprise that we should have to remind ourselves again and again to think of these polarities precisely as polarities and to recall the terms of the various controversies. For example, in the case of the pseudo-contradiction between faith and reason, each new generation has the task of coming to understand how revelation joined together what had apparently been opposed. Justin, or Origen, had to carry out this task in their age, and Thomas Aquinas and Nicholas of Cusa had to do it on their own. It's not a surprise that we should have to repeat the same investigation and reflections that Kant, Jacobi, Bader, or Schelling had to do 2 centuries ago. It goes without saying that we are, as to say, the contemporaries of Jacobi writing against Lessing, or of Bader offering his lessons of religious philosophy against Jacobi and Hegel. In a certain sense, it's true that nihil novi sub sole. Each age has to appropriate for itself the novelty of Christianity and to consider for itself how Christ reconciles the opposites, especially the so-called contradiction between reason and faith that every age is tempted to solidify and harden again. And so we too need to reenact for ourselves the controversy between faith and reason for our own age, in the context of our philosophy. The polarity remains a vacuum, an empty word, if it's not filled with the whole content of our present culture. That is why I will propose to you 2 complementary steps that need to be taken if we are to clarify the polarity in our current situation. At first, an anabatic, or that means ascending way, and a katabatic, that means a descending one. First point, the from below or ascending way to connect reason with faith, according to 2 contemporary authors, whose name is Emmanuel Falk and Lorenz Bruno Puntel. If our generation is facing the same situation that Kant did, namely the situation in which it must question for itself the polarity between faith and reason, the terms of the debate have nevertheless quite clearly changed. On a very factual and superficial level, we can see that our time is essentially characterized by what? By the models of reason that are presented, on the one hand, by phenomenology, and, on the other, by analytic or theoretical philosophy. Looking more deeply, and perhaps more accurately, at the present situation, we might make a claim similar to Husserl's interpretation in Crisis, that the real line of demarcation lies between a strong, rational conception of mind and the anti-rational philosophies of life. The historical landscape of philosophy that is shared by phenomenology and analytic philosophy is traversed by a fundamental separation between strong and weak models of reason. Following page. There have been some important thinkers, most notably Paul Ricoeur, who have tried to come to terms with the whole spectrum of that kind of positions. Ricoeur's philosophy lies at the core of modern thinking and was able not only to develop a coherent and integrative philosophy that took all the philosophical models into consideration, but also to propose a new way of articulating the relation between faith and reason in our context. The problem, however, is that Ricoeur's work is not complete, nor is it the most up-to-date. It is not complete insofar as Ricoeur's thought is essentially concentrated on the level of the text and its interpretation. That's why it's not enough to simply return to Ricoeur's work. We must also consider some of the most recent attempts to reconcile the various models of philosophical reason with the Christian faith. I would like, on this score, to draw particularly your attention to two important endeavors to meet the contemporary models of reason, phenomenology versus analytic philosophy, weak reason versus strong, on a more coherent and integral level than Ricoeur was able to attain. What these two approaches have in common is that they are strictly philosophical at the beginning, and they expand reason, opening it up to faith, by means of internal reflection and enlargement at the end. That is why I will speak here of a from below, from finitude approach, which is distinct from the approach I will examine later in the second part of my paper. What are the two approaches I am speaking of? In fact, they represent for our time exactly the same famous historical complementarity between Blondel and Thomism that the history has known. I will illustrate these two approaches by naming two living thinkers, Emmanuel Falk and Lorenz Bruno Puntel. But these names are certainly not the only ones that could be invoked. The first, Emmanuel Falk. Emmanuel Falk offers a genuine opportunity for both phenomenology and the weak model of reason to encounter the Christian faith. The second one, Puntel, is one, be prepared, is one, according to me, of the most powerful thinkers of the present time. His approach leads both analytic philosophy and the strong model of reason at once to the possibility of faith. Falk develops a strategy for overcoming the phenomenological and weak reason models that are resistant to faith, whereas Puntel does the same for the analytical and strong reason models. The two approaches are entirely complementary and ought to be considered together. The first of them, the experience of faith in Falk's phenomenology. I will summarize. Emmanuel Falk is a good representative of contemporary French Catholic phenomenology, and the recent developments of his thought are reaching a very interesting point of maturation. It's good to read him within the broad context of I won't read that. On the next page, at the top of the next page. There has been a significant development in Falk's thinking, to such an extent that one can identify an important difference between his first books and the latest one. The last book, which is probably the best achieved of this prolific author, is entitled Crossing the Rubicon, Philosophy and Theology, an essay on the borderlines. Passer le Rubicon, Philosophie et Théologie, Essai sur les frontières. This text, which Falk presents as the hidden method of his entire thought is centered on the question of the relationship between philosophy and faith considered from the perspective of the history of phenomenology and hermeneutics. In these very important second and third parts of this fascinating opus, Falk directly confronts the idea of a purely rational philosophy, drawing on all the resources of the most advanced phenomenology, in particular the insights of the late Husserl of experience and judgment, and fighting against the Heideggerian rejection of theology in philosophical thinking. Falk bravely struggles against his opponents and towards the Christian polarity of faith and reason. Taking, for example, some distance from his teacher Jean-Luc Marion, Falk develops a brilliant philosophy of the decision of faith. Falk insists on the cooperation of man and God in the act of believing. Doing so, he reintroduces a theory of the agent secundum. God operates in us when we direct our action towards him by making the decision to believe. Deus est causa decidendi omnibus decidentibus. This is why Falk talks at the end of his book of a French word, tuilage. I think in English you can say an overlapping. Of a tuilage between reason and faith, or in other words, of a recovering of philosophy by theology. That decision is nevertheless an act which originates in God himself and which eliminates the limits and the finitude themselves. Faith is not juxtaposed to reason. There is a conversion and a metamorphosis of philosophy by theology. Philosophy, I quote, philosophy is transformed and converted in its contact with theology. It's at this moment, according to Falk, that there occurs the reciprocal transformation of philosophy into theology. That is why Falk can end his book with a striking slogan, I quote, the more we theologize, the better we philosophize. Point 2, Puntel and logic's movements toward God. I promised earlier to speak about another author who is of great interest in the contemporary debate between faith and reason. That author is Lorenz Bruno Puntel, who is, to my mind, one of the greatest philosophers of our time. Just as noetic thought, that means a thought which is led by concepts, just as noetic thought is needed to complete, in the Blondelian words, the pneumatic thought, that means a thought that is led by the percepts and not only the concepts. In Blondel's conception of thought, Puntel's metaphysics serves to fill the absence of speculative mediation in Falk's thinking. While Falk deals with experience and phenomena without being able to articulate conceptually the finite and the infinite, Puntel concerns himself with judgment, theories, and logical matters. That is why Puntel is one of the best, according to me, is one of the best Christian experts to help us to think in a rigorous way the connection between both the strong reason model and the tradition of analytic philosophy. The easiest entry into Puntel's thought is to view him as the heir of a fourfold tradition. He inherits from Thomas Aquinas, Hegel, Frege, and Heidegger. Puntel's two masterpieces have been translated into English under the following titles: Structure and Being and God. Puntel calls its philosophy a structural systematic philosophy because it's based on sophisticated analysis of the mathematical, logical, semantic, and ontological structures of theories in language, and because it aims to explore the whole panentheist complex of relations between contingent and necessary being. We can perceive in this very abstract summary that Puntel's thinking falls along the line of rational metaphysics, and that what is important for it is the noetic problems of the concept that concerns the question of the God in whom we believe. Puntel, who thus fulfills Thomas Aquinas' prudent requirements, prevents us from passing directly from the phenomena from our experience to theology or to faith, which is much more the pneumatic path that Blondel or Falk followed. Puntel makes a very strict and severe demand. The path from philosophy to faith is a possible way, but it's framed or bordered by rigorous conceptual distinctions and qualifications. If we wish to compare Falk's pneumatic method with Puntel's noetic one, we could say the following for Falk: the link between reason and faith is experienced in a decision that has its roots in God's actions itself. We act because God acts in us. The finite phenomena are resolved into an infinite phenomenon. For Puntel, on the contrary, the bridge is composed of conceptual bricks and rational cement. Contingent beings are allowed in being by the necessary being, which is able to be experienced in religious experience. Then, the contemporary books of Falk and Puntel illustrate for our time the classic complementarity between the noetic and pneumatic methods for bridging faith and reason. There nevertheless remains a third possibility for joining faith and reason together today in the Christian polarity between the two, which proceeds neither from the finite to the infinite, nor from reason to faith. This is a descending method from above, which proceeds from faith to reason. This third way, which is distinct from both Blondel, Falk's and Thomas Puntel's solutions, was illustrated 200 years ago by a romantic German philosopher, Franz von Baader, and lies very close to the more contemporary efforts of Claude Breuer and Ferdinand Ulrich. According to this approach, we think because we are thought. I will later add, moreover, that we love because we are loved. It's the second part of my contribution, which is more short. The from above approach to connecting faith and reason, after Claude Breuer and Ferdinand Ulrich. First point, towards a metaphysics of love after Baader and, surprise, Balthasar. We have just considered how to connect reason to faith from what I called an anabatic approach, using both a pneumatic and a noetic method. Those approaches are based on a rational analysis of finitude, which is linked to theological faith. As I mentioned before, there is another path, a katabatic one, to eliminate the Christian polarity. I don't have in mind here a philosophy of religion, the objects of which are guided by external theologumena. Instead, I'm talking about what von Baader called a religious philosophy, which is determined from within by religious experience. In this context, it's a question of rational coherence and a rational extension from the inner core of the act of faith. But we have to find out what is the inner core of the Christian faith. It's not so easy. Is it the power of the Creator? Is it the intelligence of the Logos? Is it the cross, the redemption? Is it the church? What is the most emphatic and comprehensive mystery of Christian faith? After Hegel researches, and above all, after Balthasar's solution, we can say that the mystery of the Trinity is the inner core of the Christian faith. But that mystery must be interpreted in the primary sense as love. Trinity as love is the real center of the Christian faith, and everything in faith is to be interpreted in its light. We cannot minimize the importance of centering the faith on the Trinity and love, which was brought about by Hegel and therefore by Balthasar. This represents, to my mind, the turning point of theology in modern and contemporary dogmatics. In the present context, which is the question of the relation between faith and reason, there is a range of consequences that have to be taken into consideration. If Trinitarian love is the core of Christian faith, we have to implement the method of Bader to such an extent that we take love to be also the first ground for philosophy. We have to continue Bader's reversal of philosophy up to the point that we love because we are loved, and not only because we think because we are thought. That is to say that after Balthasar, the Baderian method consists in exploring the total breadth of the statement amor ergo amo. After Balthasar, the religious link between faith and reason is transformed into a metaphysics on love, and that's my conclusion, the principal features of a contemporary metaphysics of love. It goes without saying that we don't have the time here to develop in an exhaustive sense what such a metaphysics of love is or could be. We only have the opportunity to refer to some important authors that enrich the theme and to some valuable remarks on the topics. In the first case, we need to point out the philosophers who have dealt with the theme of gift from a metaphysical point of view. As you know, the notion of gift is becoming more and more a kind of, I hope to say it correctly, a paradigm.
Very good.
In contemporary Catholic philosophy, as well as in contemporary theology. Professor Antonio Lopez, brand new book, it was published on Thursday. It's really a brand new book, which is entitled Gift and the Unity of Being, is one, according to me, I have read it, one of the purest, I think it, and finest witnesses of this growing pattern in contemporary Catholic thought. As Professor Lopez observes, the question of being cannot be asked from a phenomenological viewpoint alone, but it needs a genuinely metaphysical framework if we are to get beyond the order of phenomena and penetrate to the level of being itself. In that context, two authors appear to be of singular interest. Claude Breuer, especially in the book of his maturity, L'être et l'esprit, and the fellow of En source from Balthasar, Ferdinand Ulrich. For both author thinkers, being in its depth is pure gift, and that means pure spirit. The mystery of the Holy Trinity in both cases is the key to the interpretation of being. But the two thinkers propose, even if they do not refer explicitly to Bader, a kind of religious philosophy that connects Trinitarian faith to philosophy. The result is for Breuer as well as for Ulrich, a metaphysics of gift which appears to be the most advanced Christian religious philosophy of our time. After Breuer and Ulrich, a question nevertheless remains unsolved. Is a metaphysics of gift the only way to represent, from a philosophical point of view, love in the life of Trinity? Is gift, in other words, the only dimension of love? That question could be posed in two directions. First, is a metaphysics of love complete without the dimension of not only the gift, but the reception of the gift, the assent? Moreover, is the assent not a real core dimension of love, rather than simply a kind of secondary moment of it? Anyone who has read Hegel knows that this question is a fundamental one. Second, especially in light of Sheben and Balthasar, don't we have to recognize a third dimension of love, which is the essential characteristic of the Holy Spirit? What I have in mind is the fecundity of love, in which difference and unity interpenetrate at the highest level. To put it briefly, the charismatic connection between Trinitarian faith and religious philosophy would receive, as a result of the two lines of questions, not only the form of a metaphysics of gift, but in order to be a complete metaphysics of love itself, it would take the shape of a simple threefold metaphysics of gift, of consent, and of fruition. In this way, really and truly, amor ego amo, cogito ergo cogitor. The methodological reversal of the debate between reason and faith, which was inaugurated by Baader, could thus be achieved in a tri-dimensional metaphysics of love. That is not to say that the ascending approach inspired by or similar to that of Blondet or Thomas Aquinas would be neglected or rejected. On the contrary, only a complete, systematic complementarity of the anabatic and katabatic approaches is able to describe the full polarity of reason and faith that lies at the core of the mystery of the incarnation. Thomas Aquinas, Blondel, Baader, and Balthasar offer our age a general response to the question of the link between faith and reason. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tourpe, for that magnificent exposition and for sticking to the time. Our next speaker is, I'm sure, known to many of you, Dr. D.C. Schindler, who's Associate Professor of Metaphysics and Anthropology here at the Institute, and is also one of the editors of Communio, International Catholic Review, and also the author of many publications also on similar topics, faith and reason, metaphysics, and so forth. His most recent book, which I saw somebody had a copy, is this one, The Catholicity of Reason, which is a beautiful book. So thank you very much, Professor Schindler.
Thank you, Adrian. The title of my paper is On Reason's Authority, which has four meanings, and all of those are intended, but I need to stay on track, so I'll let you unfold that in your own minds. The paper's too long to read, so I'm going to try to just lay out the argument of the paper as best as I can in a kind of a linear fashion here. The assigned topic, as Adrian said at the outset, is that faith is the fulfillment of reason. We heard that last night as well. In Father Daly's paper from Gregory Nazianzus, and it was very interesting. The question that was raised that's a startling assertion that faith can fulfill reason, because we think of typically reason, faith as falling away in the eschaton, and so direct sight seems to perfect faith and surpass it. So it's actually quite a paradoxical and fascinating question. How, in what sense, can faith be the fulfillment of reason? And I want to suggest that this is only possible if there's a genuine analogy between faith and reason, which means that it can only be the case that faith fulfills reason if reason itself has a form that is analogous to the form of faith. And so my paper explores this. It's an attempt to show that there is such an analogy. and it tries to do so by reflecting on the question, what role does authority play in reason, in philosophical reason? And the reason it focuses on that question is it's typically taken to be the case that it's precisely authority that distinguishes faith from reason. We can take a passage from Aquinas. He says, although the argument from authority based on human reason is the weakest, yet the argument from authority based on divine revelation is the strongest. Authority is something essential to faith, and the reason it's essential to faith is that faith is rooted in the self-revelation of God, in the historical person of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And so faith is both supernatural, it's beyond, it has its origins beyond natural evidence, you might say, and it's also essentially historical. And in that sense, it's not something that we simply see for ourselves in a direct way, but rather we essentially rely on a tradition of personal witness to this historical event and its meaning, guided by the Holy Spirit. So faith is rooted, has an essential connection with authority. By contrast, philosophy is famously no respecter of persons, you might say. Aristotle says that that a philosopher owes greater piety to truth than to one's friends. And of course, when he said that, he meant Plato. He was thinking of Plato in particular. But Plato himself referred always to Socrates in his writings, as you all know. And when you see how Socrates reasons, it's very interesting. He's always pointing away from his person and to the truth. In a beautiful little moment in the symposium, Agathon gave a speech on love, and Socrates, with a few decisive questions, just tears it apart. It falls apart. And Agathon says, Socrates, it's impossible to contradict you. And Socrates says, no, my dear Agathon, it's impossible to contradict the truth. It's very easy to contradict Socrates. So it's about the truth, it's not about himself. He says, moreover, in the Phaedrus, that he would gladly learn from rocks and trees as long as they teach the truth. It doesn't have to come from a person. As long as it's true, it's what he desires. It does not matter who says something. The question is whether what is said is true. So a deep, long philosophical tradition that recognizes this idea that truth in some essential way speaks for itself, and because truth speaks for itself, it has to be seen for itself. The notion of seeing a natural truth for oneself is decisive. Now, given all of that, it seems that to jump some centuries here, it seems to be the case that John Locke was espousing a rather traditional view, rather than he's presented as being revolutionary in his conception of reason. But it seems from our initial reflections here that he was presenting a fairly traditional view when he wrote the following, quote, "It is conceit, fancy, extravagance, anything rather than understanding, if the mind of rational creatures must be under the constraint of receiving and holding opinions by the authority of anything but their own, not fancied, but perceived evidence." That would seem to be just a restatement of what we saw with Plato and Socrates. But I suggest if we take that passage from Locke, what it implies is a complete opposition between faith and reason. If faith in some sense depends on authority and reason is defined specifically in contrast to authority, then the two are dialectical opposites, and they can't be integrated. And it means I don't need to unfold all of the problematic implications of that, but just to point out, it would mean then that the moment faith begins, reason ends, and that has implications for what reason means, and it has implications for faith. Faith becomes something that's essentially irrational. So the question is there a different way to interpret this? Is there a different way to think about it? Is there a way to understand reason with a more positive relation to authority? and it seems to me the way to approach this is to ask the question of the role specifically of personal witness in truth. Now, in philosophical reasoning, the role of personal witness. Now, as soon as we think of the issue in those terms and look back at the philosophical tradition, you can't help immediately but think of Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher, as you all know. For Kierkegaard, personal witness was essential to truth. For him, truth, essential truth, can't be seen, can't be properly understood outside of the full engagement of the person in infinite passion. He uses that expression often, infinite passion. And it's infinite passion because it's a response to something that's recognized as being infinitely meaningful, that it's a truth that bears on absolutely everything. And if it bears on absolutely everything, there's no way that you can come to know it outside of it. You can only come to know it because you've handed yourself over to it in a certain sense. You've committed yourself to it. And so there's an essential risk in this. You can't secure yourself before making the leap, as he would put it. It's something that the truth becomes evident in making the leap. And so very beautifully he talks about understanding truth in a certain way by analogy of falling in love. It's something that you have to sort of yield yourself to for it to be true. Now, there's something very positive about that, this notion of personal engagement and personal witness that I said we need to find somewhere in our understanding of reason. But there's also a deep, deep problem in Kierkegaard's notion. He presents this idea of the centrality of personal witness precisely in relation to his conception of truth as subjectivity. He says truth is subjective. And he goes so far as to say in this passage that, in fact, the truth is the infinite passion. It doesn't matter the content of what you're passionate about. What's important is this total commitment. And it seems to me quite clear what would be lacking in that. You leave an objective sense of truth entirely behind. And you're faced with the question, well, is there any connection between that sort of personal engagement for these existential truths, matters of life and death, and just everyday normal truth, normal judgment in the typical sense of the term? Okay, so Kierkegaard is inadequate here. We can, it seems to me, dig deeper in the tradition and find some help from one of the classical texts on the meaning of truth, which is Aquinas' De Veritate. It's a classical text where he unfolds truth as a transcendental property of being. Now, excuse me, that is a notoriously difficult and complex text, and we can't unfold it here in any great detail, but I want to just try to get to the essential point for my argument here, and that is his description of truth as a transcendental property. He describes it specifically as one of the positive relational transcendental properties. It's positive, it's relational in that it's not just what being in itself is, but it's relational because it's being specifically in its relation to the human soul, Aquinas says. But he also says it's a positive relation, and there's something incredibly extraordinary about that and very mysterious about that. What it means is that the relationship to the soul, in a certain sense, it's a positive relationship, which means in a certain sense it adds something to being. And I use the quotation marks and qualify in a certain sense because it doesn't add something from the outside. It rather genuinely contributes something, but I'd like to put it thus, as always in a certain sense from the inside of being. Perhaps a simple, relatively simple way of putting this is this description of truth as a positive relational transcendental means that truth is objective. It's a property of being, a quality of being, but it's a property or quality that belongs to being precisely in its relation to the human soul, not outside of that. So more concretely speaking, it seems to me that the way we can put this a little more descriptively, I suppose, is to say what I see is implied in this notion is that when we know things, in our knowing of things, the things themselves arrive at their truth. The truth that belongs to them, that they possess, is something in a certain sense that comes to be in our very knowing of them. That there's something in fact occurs in that knowing. Now, this does not mean that the truth of things is something that the mind projects onto them. It's not, the mind doesn't give truth to things. Truth is not a human construct. It's not something that the mind makes. What I'm suggesting is that that our knowing, the soul's knowing relationship to things, liberates the truth that they in fact possess. If you go into the detail of the text, which we can't do here, Aquinas articulates truth in the nature of truth in an analogous way. He gives three definitions. But what it amounts to is that truth is genuinely ontological, that comes to its actuality in the union with the human soul, which then gives birth to a statement, an expression about what it is. You say the truth. And if you understand that in a genuinely analogical sense, we see in Aquinas something that anticipates something Heidegger says very profoundly many years later, and that is that a profound thinker or poet who says things well, it brings out a truth that they wouldn't otherwise have, or wouldn't at least otherwise appear to have, that there's something genuinely generative and creative in proper knowing and saying. In modern language, we can interpret Aquinas' view of truth as a positive relational transcendental property of being, as affirming what? As affirming that all truth is mediated in principle by human freedom. All truth is mediated in principle by human freedom. Now note, to say this implies an interpretation of freedom, not in the first place as spontaneous choice between options, but rather as including the whole positive contribution of the human soul. But even more, freedom in this statement means that it's not a spontaneous, deliberate act in the first place, but in the first place it has the form of a radical letting be. It's freedom as rooted in being, and has the form of a letting be of the truth of things. And only in that conception can you understand this positive transcendental relationship as actually affirming truth as objective, as belonging to being, quality of being itself. Okay. We see this very abstract, perhaps, statement, description about things. It's something that's part of our concrete experience, it seems to me, that we see that truth requires freedom. I mean, even something as straightforward as a self-evident truth that the world exists, say. This is what the classical tradition would call a self-evident truth. Self-evident would seem to mean that it's true without needing anything else. But notice, it's a truth that one has to give one's assent to for it to be actualized as a truth. And we see that that's the case because we can look at the history of modern philosophy as never being willing to make that assent. There was an insistence that for something to be true, it has to compel you, and it can compel you only through rational argument. So argument after argument was made for this thing that's actually self-evidently true. But to say it's self-evidently true, I suggest, does not mean that it's true in spite of and outside of the human soul, but it's a truth that's mediated in the free assent of recognition there. Even more obviously, it seems to me, we recognize that the kinds of truth that insights and understandings that come to be in the long work of reasoning, thinking something through. A great thinker can penetrate some reality and some idea and bring something to light that otherwise would never have been seen, that a truth about the meaning of reality comes to manifestation, and it does so as the fruit of deep and long reflection and inquiry, a free act of a person. Now, this sort of a truth, it's very interesting. In order to be able to understand it, to be able to receive it, others to receive it, it's not enough just to see the fruit. The insight that's produced isn't just a fact that's perfectly evident on the surface of things. In order to really understand that kind of a truth, that kind of an insight, we have to see it precisely as an insight, precisely as the fruit of a fruit that has ripened, you might say, and matured through deep and long personal devotion from the thinker. And so it's only entering into the thinking, the reasoning, the act of freedom, you might say, at the root of that fruit that we can properly understand it. Okay. Now, given all of that, which of course opens all sorts of questions that perhaps we can discuss later, but given all of that, we can return to this question of the role of personal witness and authority in reason. Now, I just asserted that a deep thinker, a genuine philosopher, reasons in a fruitful way. Through a deep engagement of his person, he brings forth the truth of being. You might say he augments the truth of being. He magnifies it. Now, the root of the word auctoritas, authority, is augere, to make grow, to bring forth, to augment, to increase, to magnify. In this etymological sense, we see that reason, interpreted here, in light of this text from De Veritate, reason is essentially an authority. Reason is essentially an authority. It magnifies the truth of being. It, in its free and creative, generative grasp of what is, it magnifies the truth of being. Now, if that's the case, we can take a look at Socrates again, as Plato presents him in the dialogues. Initially, we are looking at that as Socrates pointing away from himself and towards the truth. And that might seem initially to be showing that philosophical truth is not a matter of personal witness, right? But notice, it's not that there's not a personal witness there, but rather, in this case, the personal witness takes a particular form. In the person of Socrates, the personal witness is this self-effacement before the meaning of reality, a kind of pointing away from himself, not I, but the truth. It must increase while I must decrease. That is the form of personal witness that that augments, magnifies the truth of being. Now, in doing so in such a decisive and paradigmatic way, Socrates, he became, as Plato presents him, a midwife of truth in others. Others became fruitful under his questioning. But he's so paradigmatic, you might say, so decisive, that he's a midwife not only for his contemporaries there, but he has remained a midwife through history. He's a constant source of philosophical reflection. So much so, we could say that his personal witness is so decisive and paradigmatic. In a certain sense, I like to suggest we could define philosophy as a contemplatio Socratis. That's, next to the other classical definitions of philosophy, one, I think, legitimate one is that philosophy of its essence, in a way, is a contemplation of the figure of Socrates. And you don't think of it that way, but if you look through history, that has been a way that philosophy has been understood. I'm not saying it's the only definition of philosophy, but it seems to me one that brings to light this role of personal witness. Okay, all of that being said, a crucial question remains, and it seems to me this is perhaps the most fundamental question for the argument that I'm making. I've been talking about reason as authoritative, as an authority in its magnification of the truth of being. But one might object that, nevertheless, I can recognize reason as authoritative, but ultimately and ideally, it ought to be my reason and my authority. So a question that we need to ask is there something philosophical? Can it be, in fact, genuinely philosophical to be beholden to the reason specifically of another? Can it be philosophical to be beholden to the reason of another, in one sense? To make that objection, we can point to Socrates and we can say Socrates himself wanted the truth to be known. He wanted his personal witness in a way to fall away, to disappear, so that finally this is a truth that you yourself are seeing. And hanging on to Socrates in a certain sense would be a betrayal of that. Is there some sense in which it's valuable to receive truth from another? Okay, in a philosophical sense. It seems to me there are two responses that we can make to this objection. The first one is a historical one, you might say, and that is the simple recognition that being beholden to the reasoning of another is inescapable. It's simply inescapable. Not only all of the ideas that we learn and the things that we pick up through our culture and our family and our schooling and so forth, but in fact every single word in which we do our thinking and speaking, every single word is something that we've received. And words are themselves always the fruit of the human mediation of the truth of being. Words themselves, in a certain sense, they embedded in every word is an insight into the meaning of reality. And that's why philosophical reflection can often take the form of etymologies, thinking about the roots of the words. And notice what you do when you unpack that. You're showing that this meaning that's being conveyed in these words that I'm using, it's a meaning that isn't one that I've discovered. It's a meaning that I've received, and in a certain sense, it's beyond my particular control or deliberate use. It's something that comes to light in my reflection on words. So the very fact of using language at all is being beholden to the reflection of another. And along these very same lines, we could say whenever we reflect in a particularly philosophical way, even to use the word being, and to think of essence, existence, and so forth, when we use these terms, we are in fact thinking with Plato and Aristotle and company. Whether we are explicit and conscious of that or not, we're thinking with them. This is the fruit of their insights that we are, that's in a way built into the ground of our own thinking. Okay, so that's the first response to the question, is that reception from others is inescapable. But still more decisively, we've shown that it's inescapable in some sense, but we have to ask, is it good? Is it positively good to receive the truth, insight from another? And in response to that question, I'd like to make this claim here, which is probably the main thesis of my paper, and that's the following. Insofar as the freedom that mediates the truth of being has to be understood as rooted in being and having the basic form of a radical receptivity, insofar as that is the nature of freedom that we're talking about, if it's to magnify the truth of being and its reception, it follows that the reception of an insight from another person is precisely a privileged mode of possessing any insight, a privileged mode of possessing an insight. And in this respect, actually coming up with an idea yourself, seeing it simply yourself, becomes a deficient mode of reasoning. There's something less than ideal in that. It might be necessary, but it's no longer the ideal form of reasoning. Now, in light of that claim, I hope it's true, it seems to me we can turn around again and look at Plato's Contemplatio Socratis in the dialogues in a new way. What's most remarkable there is not only Socrates' constant and dramatic self-effacement with respect to the truth of being. As remarkable as that is, that's not the most remarkable. There's an even more hidden self-effacement there, and that's Plato's self-effacement with respect to Socrates. In presenting his philosophy in this particular way in these dialogues, Plato is presenting himself precisely as receiving his insight from another. And it seems to me that we can think of the dialogues, the Platonic dialogues, as one big argument from authority in this philosophical sense. And even Aquinas, I quoted him at the beginning, Aquinas says that the argument from authority is the weakest in matters of reason. And what he means by that, of course, is that it's a weak form of possessing an insight simply to accept it as true because somebody else said it, simply in that form. But you can't read more than 3 lines of Aquinas without having him citing an authority. It's constant citing of authority. I mean, so much so that, in fact, Aquinas will never say anything himself unless he can't find somebody else having said it before him. And it seems to me that's essential to what reasoning means. In light of this, we look back again at that passage from John Locke and we see that that's not at all traditional. There's something novel there, and that is the hostility to the reception of opinions from others. That is never the case in classical reasoning. And in light of these reflections, it seems to me that we see that hostility to personal witness, hostility to authority, hostility to receiving from another is not at all the purification of reason that Locke presents it as. In fact, it's a corruption of reason, and moreover, it's an extraordinary ignorance of the fact that every word he speaks, he's received, and every thought that he is expressing in some sense comes from others. So my conclusion, and I did make it, my conclusion is that reason is not inimical to authority, but is in principle fructified by it, because reason is essentially participational, you might say. It's a seeing for oneself, always with and through others. And only thus can it be fulfilled, can it be understood to be fulfilled by the act of faith, in which, as Lumen Fidei says, we entrust ourselves so much to another, Christ in this case, that we in fact see with his eyes. That becomes a fulfillment of reason in this case. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really beautiful. I mean, officially we have 20 minutes, but I'm wondering, since we started late, could we take at least an extra 5 minutes to say we end at 35 after, and so we have a good 25 minutes to really talk about things. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth having a discussion based on the contributions of both papers. And so the only thing that I would ask is that when people do intervene, it really is in the spirit of sort of thinking with that Dave Schindler just mentioned, so that there really is a kind of also a continuity of the discussion. Do you guys want to talk to each other first before we sort of open it up, or?
We had lunch yesterday.
Oh, you had lunch yesterday, yeah. Was it filmed so that we could watch it afterwards, or was it? Do you want to, or should we just open it up? Okay. And if people asking Professor Tourpe a question could speak slowly and clearly, articulate slowly and clearly, because their American accents are probably, for somebody who's learned British English, is probably difficult. So, without further ado, let's open it up. Wait a minute. The one I saw first was Michele Benetti. Sorry. Go ahead, Michele.
I have a question for David Schindler. The question is, if this is the analogy between faith and reason is a positive concept of authority that is already there in reason. So what is the difference then between the two, between the authority that we receive? Because as we know, analogy also entails also a distinction there. And yes.
Yeah. That's a good. Can you hear me? Is this on? Is this one? Test. No. I think the battery would be out.
Yeah, use mine.
So,
I can.
Yes. Okay. There we go. That's an excellent question, and I touched on it in the longer paper, but because it's a crucial one. It seems to me that two points in response to that. One is that I would want to insist on the analogy. It's an analogous notion of authority. So. That implies not only that they're similar, but there's a significant difference between the nature of authority in the two cases. And one is, it seems to me that authority in faith will necessarily take an ecclesial, institutional, official form, a magisterium, in a way that would not be appropriate in philosophy. And in fact, that notion of the role of authority in reasoning was proposed in the 19th century in some of the French thinkers of the Restoration in response to the French Revolution, and was then condemned by the Church precisely because it represents an undermining of reason. I think that's a very important point. So it's authority in a much more analogous sense. But then the second point, and it's connected to this first, is, and I haven't thought through the details of this, but it seems to me there's a certain sense in which the seeing for oneself in dependence and relation and receptivity from another is a way of formulating what the act of reason would be. So that the primacy is the seeing, but it's in and with others, and the primacy in faith, I would suggest, very much along the lines of Father Paolo Prosperi's paper, which I think this is kind of a philosophical complement to, in a way, that the primacy in faith is the entrusting of oneself to another, and seeing as sort of a fruit of that. And now, obviously, you can't temporalize that primacy, and you have to be careful. You can't turn that into a dialectical opposition, so that they're both at once. But the primacy in the one case is the seeing, and the primacy in the other case is the entrusting, perhaps. Anyway, that's just a first attempt. I'm not sure that's fully adequate. But
Professor John McCarthy.
Thanks for Dr. Schindler for his very nice remarks. I just have two observations, and I don't need the microphone.
But you're going to get it anyway. Yeah.
There needs to be the devil. Just this, I'm sure you know, one of the first jokes, maybe the first joke in the Summa Theologiae is Thomas's observation. As Boethius says, arguments from authority are of the weakest sort. Just to confirm you. And I think he must have known it was a joke, though also true. Just a kind of friendly observation that there's another way in which you could say there's analogously a role for authority in reason in one's own authority to oneself. That is, and this is very Socratic, to submit oneself to the measure of being consistent in what one says, and to not only that you're consistent with what you did say, but even more that you be consistent with what you want to say, so that you be willing to renounce what you had said before, because it puts you in contradiction. So that my relation to myself involves us in a certain way a kind of authority that also in insights that I've had, that to be true to them is to recognize that they have a claim over my judgment now, and looking ahead, that there's a claim on my person in its ideality, if you will. I don't possess my person in that sense in my speech. So.
Thank you. That's excellent. Yes. Yeah.
This young lady here, yeah, next to Kathleen.
Thank you, both of you, for wonderful presentations. Dr. Tourpe, you were speaking about how the interpretation for being has its key in the mystery of the Trinity, which I thought was very beautiful. And then Dr. Schindler, I wonder if you might speak a bit about this understanding of reason as having a Trinitarian form, if it's not beyond your...
Beyond my
pass it on, yeah.
That's a very, very deep question. I need to ponder that. Do you have a this? I mean, because because a question like that really would require a lot more reflection. So this will be a superficial answer. But yeah. Along the lines of something that Professor Tourpe said about the thinking of the Trinitarian relations in terms of love, I mean, clearly this notion of reason is as having an intrinsic connection to authority, is connected with a notion of reason and deeply in relation with love. And I drew so much on Plato here, but that's very clear for him. Logos and eros are inseparable, essentially. One of the elements that comes out there is you think of if you think of the Trinitarian relations, the classical ways thinking of the procession of the Son as the mode of the intellectual mode, and the procession of the Spirit in the mode of the will. If you think of reason, actually I'm going the other way, aren't I? But I've started down that path. This notion of reason as being fruitful and magnifying the other gives you both a different way of thinking of an intellectual procession in the Trinity, it seems to me, in one respect, but then also in the other direction, it brings out precisely this dimension of the fruitfulness of reasoning that might not be so evident otherwise. Let me just...
And according to me, the point is that most of the time we are questioning only the relationship between reason to faith, and we are trying to make a bridge between the two. And most of the time we are forgetting one thing which is very important according to me, that is the bridge, on the contrary, from faith to reason, and which is not only filled with theology, but which has some philosophical issues also. I can give an example. For example, for philosophers today, one of the most important questions, metaphysically speaking, is the question of difference in being. Yeah, that's an Heideggerian topic. How is it possible to take seriously the question of the difference inside being if you don't question the difference inside Trinity itself, himself? I mean, the main difference between nature and persons. Or is it possible to question being in its roots as a difference without questioning the difference of the pure being, which is a Trinitarian difference? Yeah, that's the point. I think that we forget most of the time to question that religious philosophy, and that we think that theology is the reason of the faith. It's not correct. There are philosophical consequences of our faith, and above all of our Trinitarian faith.
Don Paolo. And then Father Antonio. Sorry, I'm neglecting this half of the room, sorry.
No, I would have 10 questions, but I can just ask one. Professor Tourpe, yeah, you were saying at the end, tangentially touching upon a point that is actually also dear to me very much, and I'm trying to think through that, but it's still a very open one. So you were saying, in a sense, one of the most profound questions that we have to think after Balthasar, in a sense, or through Balthasar and companies, is actually the most basic and only apparently obvious one, that is, what is love?
Yeah.
I actually 100% agree with you, and I think it's a very big question. For example, so I would like you to say something more about that, because, yeah, for sure, there is, on the one hand, we can look at the history, so to speak, of the evolution of the Christian thought about love through the lens of this classical and I think stereotypical idea of the passage from Eros to Agape. But then when we actually go deep into the Johannine understanding of Agape, we come to see that actually all the issue of reciprocity and therefore the integration of Eros is already there. And therefore, so what is love, and how would you, it's not that you have to answer here, but how would you address this question? You were already saying something, assent, but...
Yes. I must be brief, of course, but if I want to synthesize what I'm thinking, is that you can't consider the whole history of theology during the 20th century as an history of love in theology. For example, if you want to consider the main differences between Karl Rahner, as a thinker, as a theologian of the desire, versus Ansus and Balthasar as a theologian at first step, as a theologian of the gift, you can summarize all theology of the 20th century from that point of view, which is a point of view of love as gift or love as desire. Yeah, for Rahner, that comes from Joseph Maréchal, interpretation of Kant and Blondel, but that's the point. You can interpret the whole revolution of the theology in the 20th century from that topic. But my point of view is that for our century, you have to reconcile both of those opposition, both of those theologies, and you cannot see as different or contradictory. Love as assent or desire, and love as a gift. You have to see them as polarities. My point, as a reader of Guardini and as a reader for a long time of Éric Pioura, is that the real Christian vision is a vision from polarities, is a vision for things not only as contradictory, but as complementary and as going together. That's also the point for love.
May I, actually, do you mind if
Yeah,
I
yeah, go ahead.
follow
Well,
up
actually, it's
with a
Father
question?
Antonio that's gonna
May I? I follow up with a question to Dr. Tourpe. That was one thing that I did want to ask you. I didn't get a chance at lunch about your paper, but it came up here. The way that you just described, on the one hand, desire, on the other hand, gift. And in your paper, you say that we, in addition to a reflection on gift, there ought to be a reflection on consent and fruitfulness. I mean, to what extent does that imply that gift is interpreted simply from the perspective of a giver, as in this sort of donative mode? I mean, isn't gift in itself also what's received? And so the theme of reception is absolutely crucial. When we talk about self-gift, we typically mean just in that giving mode. But it seems to me crucial to see that it's in recipient. And then fruitfulness, clearly, the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, as the gift of the gift, donum doni. I mean that gift includes fruitfulness too. So anyway, how would you respond to that question?
I won't respond to your question. I want just enlighten one point. When I insist on the fact that love is not only a gift or a pure gift, I'm thinking of the conception of gift of Jean-Luc Marion, indeed.
Yeah, yeah.
What is striking in Jean-Luc Marion's philosophy of phenomenology of love, of gift, is that in his phenomenology of gift, there is no more subject, there is no more nature, there is no more gift at all. When you insist in such an abstract way on the pure gift, the pure from above gift from God or to the world, you're on the edge of skipping the role of the subject. What you have said, exactly what you have said, when you insist on the role of consenting, of assenting to the gift, of assenting to authority. Yes, we are exactly on the same line. And my point is, I don't want that we how to say, we see the gift as a divinity. It's not a divinity. We can't see it as a pure abstraction. It's a gift to a subject who has to accept it, to reflect it in himself, and to reproduce it not only for himself, but for another. That is fecundity. That is the kind of reflection, pure reflection of gift in another. That's the gift as fecundity.
Father Antonio.
Yeah, I have a question. I don't know if I'm able to put it clearly. It's for both of you. Could you speak a little bit more to the relationship between truth and person? Because in the example of Socrates, for instance, that you brought up before, it's Socrates that points to the truth, right? So what is it, right? And then also because, I mean, as we know in modern philosophy, and the ideal is to get rid of the witness, right? So affirm the self-effaciousness of Socrates so that one can actually contemplate directly the truth. No, this also is a little bit what Breuer says, resting on Schelling, that perhaps is this understanding of truth basically is ultimately rooted in a conception of God that is just himself, sort of a Plotinian one. So hence one in which there is no relation. So could you say a little more, why is it intrinsic, this relationship between truth and person, if it is?
You first.
All right. In obedience to authority. Yeah, another profound question. we'll have to think about. As you were asking your question, I mean, it's a very big, broad question, so it's hard to find a particular issue, focus on an issue there. But as you were explaining your question, I thought about Father Paulo's paper earlier, and this duality, this polarity of the what and the how. Typically we think of truth, especially in the modern era, as content simply. It's information, and fail to see that it's we don't reckon with the dualism of form and content in that we isolate content from form, and that's an immense problem with all sorts of implications. But a different approach to truth would be something like Hegel, when I think one of the most interesting things that he says, one of his most interesting claims, is that the true is the whole. That truth, there's a kind of a wholeness that's essential to the truth of truth that makes it, gives it the quality of truth. And in the particular context that he mentions that, there, and somewhat along the lines of the argument I was making in the paper, that truth isn't just a content, an idea, but it also involves a way, a mode of access to it. I mean, to put it in really simple terms, he says, truth is not just the result, but it's the beginning, it's the process, and the result, all understood, integrated together. And I mean, Hegel's way of doing that is obviously, as everyone always knows, it's problematic, etc. But but there's something really profound and important there that you recognize that it's a much more concrete sense of truth, and that thinking of truth in those in that way would open up this dimension of the personal witness in very concrete senses, and why is it that you really cannot learn something from the internet? I mean, you can't. The way of receiving it is very different, and the interpersonal communication is something that's really essential to it. Anyway, these are vague reflections, but I thank you for the question. It's something I'd like to think about further.
I don't know. Do we have time for one? Actually, sorry, I didn't bring my watch today.
He was going to answer the question as well. Could he
Oh,
finish?
were you going to answer the question?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Just a few words, briefly.
Okay, this will be it.
In the continuation of what has been said, according to me, one of the main evolution of progresses of the modern philosophy is to pass from a representative state of the world or representation of the world to a most integrative or systematic vision of things. For example, subject versus object and so on. But to speak of Schilling, what is interesting with Schilling is that in front of Hegel's attempt to systematically say that kind of things and to try to dialectically think them, Schilling's attempt was more and more to think at first the tension between, for example, subject and object, or truth and the people who are learning the truth, but not to fall down in a system. And the more Schelling was thinking, the more he approached to a kind of polarities in his thought. For example, the last Schelling is the thinker of the polarity between the Das and the Das in Dutch, in German, and the Was, the content, the fact that something is, and what is the thing, to take your example again. And the more Schelling was thinking, the more he discovered that we have, as the modern thought has discovered, think the things in the tension, but not in a systematic way as Hegel does. But that's the real issue of thinking the things is polarity. That's one of the main points of the last Schilling's thinking, thought. Yes.
Well, I know there were a couple more questions, but I think we have to finish here. And so just join me in thanking our two speakers.